The word heterosexual was coined in 1869 to indicate an unhealthy obsession for having sex with either men or women.
This is Exploring Unusual Sex, the podcast about odd stuff that helps understanding everyday matters. Our host today, from Milan, Italy, is author, journalist and personal coach Ayzad.
Welcome! In this episode we'll talk about bondage history, guys with two penises, sexual prophylaxis, fainting damsels and much more. Let's get starting, and the first topic is unusual sex trends. Do you know what will be in fashion next season? Well, good for you. I don't know the first thing about that, and at best I can note how trends and fads are everywhere, sex included. In this episode, I reached back to draw a map of what was fashionable during the last 30 years in the world of unusual sex, so we can walk it together and try to understand the causes and effects of every change. Let's start with the 90s of the past century. The internet was still a novelty for terminal geeks, and erotic subcultures had a very hard time consolidating due to the communication difficulties between their fans. Information was still obtained through specialized magazines that were often imported at a premium by few shops, and news were discovered in videotapes rented in shady stores. Buying a grainy 40 minutes video costed the equivalent of 110 euros of today. And yet, everyone was crazy for fetish, with latex outfits from Germany, the USA, and above all, England. In fact, for the first time ever it had become possible to manufacture garments so thin as to look painted onto your body like a shiny second skin. A dozen of specialized designers had popped up in London to create clubbing outfits and to work for professional dominatrices, who competed in promoting themselves with more and more spectacular photos pasted inside phone booths, another relic from the past. The shots were taken by specialized artists, who were also published on magazines geared toward fetishists. The fashion designers put ads on the magazines, and so on, in a whirlwind of synergies that conquered the whole world for at least a decade. Enter 1998. A Japanese porn director invents a workaround to show the money shots, that is, ejaculations, audiences are so fond of, while keeping the genitals hidden in accordance with censorship laws. That's the birth of the bukkake genre, that spreads globally, becoming especially successful in France. The trend of absurd oriental pornography also popularizes Japanese bondage, more correctly known as shibari or kimbaku. With the turn of the millennium, erotic ties in the Western style, those of pin-ups like Betty Page, say, disappear from the scene, making room for kimonos and strange suspensions from the ceiling. Tokyo Hotel's only connection with Japan is merely in the name, but starting in 2003, this band fascinated teenagers and introduced them to emo music and to other groups sharing their androgynous looks and queer-friendly lyrics in which love transcended the genders. The collateral effect is that, partly as an affectation and partly believing it, claiming to be a bisexual male became a badge of honor. For a few years, the fight against homophobia also went through that, to the dismay of a Nazi-skinned crowd who were doing exactly the same things, but in secret to keep up appearances. Girls always said it easier, but in 2005 a new fad exploded just for them. The alternative models scene, rejecting traditional beauty canons to seduce with their not necessarily anorexic, pierced and tattooed bodies. The champions are the Suicide Girls, hailing from an international team of neo-feminist pin-ups who quickly become media darlings, also appearing in video games, comics, movies and live shows. Throughout all of this, Google Trends confirms that the interest for BDSM remains constant. Even the publication of the 50 Shades trilogy in 2011 and its movie version in 2015 only read as small peaks of temporary interest that mostly inspired a rekindling of curiosity toward bondage.
Let me interrupt you just a sec for an important reminder. The episode notes contain all the links to the topics mentioned in the podcast, and if you want to dig deeper, you will find hundreds of further articles on the Ayzad.com website.
Let's resume from 2012 with the sudden notoriety of polyamory that until then had been practiced almost in secret and now becomes trendy for a while. Stats indicate that it then drifted off the radars until 2019, the year in which the reality show dedicated to it on Showtime becomes surprisingly trendy in its 7th season. I will briefly mention feminist porn as the novelty for 2013, but I intend to talk about it in depth in a future episode. The following year, however, the two most important non-conventional dating websites decide to add to their available definitions for personal profiles the term primal, and it is like opening a floodgate. All of a sudden, countless people, especially among the younger crowd, discover they love so-called primal sex, featuring violent and beast-like mating, pack dynamics, and, for the most fantasy-prone, the idea of being possessed by the animal spirit guide. Like many other phenomena I mentioned, primals too will dwindle in the subsequent years, proving how little you need to influence sexual subcultures. A second 2014 trend, albeit minor, was that of bimbos, young women who take on to an extreme level the brainless, beauty surgery-enhanced doll aesthetics to become nothing more than living sex toys. Those who study this maintain that big factors were easier access to Botox and implants and the desire of emulating public characters like the Kardashian sisters. Truth to be told, in many cases bimbos are far from stupid, choosing a possibly questionable investment that, however, often allows them the opportunity to marry into extreme wealth without too much effort. As you will have noticed, computer technology helps promoting new trends faster and faster. 2015 was the year of futanari, a Japanese term indicating female and often ephebic bodies featuring male genitals. They are basically transgender figures, but may be easier to culturally accept since they are free from the quaint mental associations between transsexuality and prostitution, or with the stereotypes of a somewhat vulgar South American trans person that dominated throughout the previous decades. The last erotic fad I could identify is from 2017 with the daddy dom and little girl couples, largely inspired by the Instagram and Tumblr millennial aesthetics and supported by 50 Shades long tail. They essentially are a less creepy version of a sugar daddy thing, in which two persons role-play the mentor and the girl to enjoy some light BDSM, with the important peculiarity that no money is exchanged and the little girls can be 30 or 40 years old. But what does the future hold for us? Making predictions never pays, yet I have found a few analysts who are betting on the return of polyamory, and above all on a 2020 marked by better sex education for adults. It would be nice if I were right, wouldn't it?
The Sexual Explorers Manifesto is a global initiative to spread a healthier and more positive approach to sexuality. You can easily find it with an online search, but in the meantime, let's take a closer look at one of its 15 items. Today's one says:
Partners are not sexual objects. Although many representations of sex suggest the idea that a partner is a tool for obtaining pleasure, the plain truth is that we are all persons with feelings, emotions, and desires that deserve to be respected. This remains true even in erotic domination games, so it is better to remind that to make any sexual activity ethical and more pleasurable, it must be approached together with the other person, without diminishing them to the role of a sex toy.
This is your moment. In every episode, we pick one question among those sent to our expert at podcast@ayzad.com. So let's get writing to get an answer like this.
One question I received today in the Exploring Unusual Sex inbox was from Susanna, who asks, I am big into Japanese bondage, which I consider a full-blown art. Talking with a girlfriend, though, we found ourselves disagreeing on its origins. As far as I know, they are very ancient, while she is saying the opposite. If you have studied this practice too, can you give me the straight story? Of course I did study it, even if I like the aesthetics of bondage, but not the self-importance of most of its exponents, who forget creativity to get entrenched in pseudo-historical and pseudo-philosophical details that are just shrugged off by legitimate Japanese people. And anyway, I guess you are somewhat both right. Please consider that metalwork spread relatively late through Japan, and especially in ancient times, the local culture always gave high importance to ropes and ties in every context. In the 16th century, they were also used by the military for ojojitsu, a martial art used on the battlefield to quickly imprison captured enemies. In that era, even regular criminals were tied up ritually, using very precise colors and figures depending on the accusation and their social stature. These ideas were first applied in an erotic way in the Matsumoto fortress at the end of the Edo period in the latter half of the 19th century, but it was a very brief fad that was reclaimed only in 1999 by the artist Seiyu Ito for a photo series titled Maidens Suffering in the Snow. The one who suffered was, more specifically, his wife, naked and suspended upside down, even if she was 8 months pregnant. The pictures were spectacular, but they remained an oddity for perverts until the Second World War, when the encounter with the sex culture of their German allies brought back traditional domination games. Kinbaku, that is, Japanese bondage, in its current form can be dated after 1946 and the publication of Kitan Club magazine, whose editors endeavored to modify old ojojitsu to make it safer and sexier. Among its readers, there also was Eikichi Ozada, who in 1965 decided to drop out of his regular job to become the first full-time bondage performer, popularizing the art of ropes in almost mainstream shows that sold out theaters featuring volunteering women from the audience undressed and tied on the stage. Ozada held his last show in 2001 on the same night of his first heart attack, supported by 4 collaborators. His funeral, a few months later, was a national event. To recap, in my opinion, Kinbaku is far from being ancient, and by the way, Western bondage is not bad too, but stretching it a bit, you aren't wrong either. After solving this doubt too, I want to remind everyone that sex should always be a pleasure, not a problem, even when it is uncommon. However, if you are experiencing issues, I can help you as a personal coach to discover together the ideal strategy to win back your happiness in this field. You can get in touch through my website ayzad.com, spelled Ayzad, and saying you are a listener of this podcast will earn you a 20% discount on the first session.
This episode is almost over, but we still have time to read one entry from XXX, the Dictionary of Unusual Sex, available in online bookstores everywhere, but in Italian only for the moment.
Today's entry is corset. It looks like the custom of making the waistline smaller has very ancient origins. Thousands of years ago, already in Crete, women wore tall rigid bands on their bellies to emphasize their hourglass shape, which is unconsciously perceived as erotic or attractive because it is typical of fertile youth. So, it is surprising that the first actual corsets were born to hinder sexuality during the Middle Age. In fact, the Christian expiatory culture was also expressed through the use of coarse and restricting garments to torment the flesh, and what could be better for this than a rough silice that made even breathing difficult? Thankfully, self-abuse diminished with time. Around the half of the 18th century, corsets became purely seductive items. The most fashionable noble women laced them with a ribbon and decorated them with a small dagger on the front. The latter was used by their men to cut the strip and undress them. The fabric band used to this day on male hats derived from the custom of flaunting the cut ribbons as proof of one's conquests. Later on, the corset became a necessary support to hold the enormous and heavy skirts of the 19th century, thus reaching its peak and launching a full fashion of wasp-weighted fainting damsels. As a matter of fact, the faintings weren't caused by an especially delicate disposition, but by the very effort of squeezing the bust as much as possible. Since breathing obviously became restricted, the lack of oxygen made collapse into the floor quite natural. The success of those garments as erotic accessories also partly depends on their influence on metabolism. Even without getting as extreme as our ancestors, some slight difficulty breathing causes a slightly arousing reaction. The feeling of constriction and the way corsets enhance the breasts and hips do the rest. The result is that they are today part of every fetishist's wardrobe, and their history is probably going to be very long yet. And that really was it. Before leaving you with one last unusual sex fact, I want to thank you for listening and invite you to follow me on my social networks and above all on my website, Ayzad.com, which is also the ideal place to sign up for my newsletter. That way you'll get straight in your inbox new articles, reviews, invitations to events, and the notification for new podcast episodes which you can listen to and comment pretty much everywhere, like iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Spreaker, and so on. If you liked exploring unusual sex, I would also like to invite you to fill the Tell Me About You form you can find linked in the episode notes, so you will help me make the next episodes even better and closer to your tastes. Finally, you can also lend a hand by telling your friends about this podcast and writing about it on your social networks. Thanks, and before moving on to the next episode, here's the fact I promised you. On a global average, every year and a half a boy is born diphallic, or having two penises.